Okay, so last talk before the panel discussion. This is us thinking about innovation policy in India. It's a paper that's co-authored with Professor Mashelkar. He ran Enmetry for a long while, and he's actually the instigator of putting together these thoughts and ideas. Uh, the other situation that has an influence in the creation of this paper is actually the Ukraine war, and the realization that through from World War One, the U.S. has dominated production and presence of, having strength and might in the global space of disputes right, between countries. And the question is, how do they do that? And they might be a really rich economy, but there are other rich economies. And we came to the realization that one of the things that you need when you want to have a really powerful armed forces is equipment that supports the armed forces. And then you need to have all kinds of changes because the world has changed, right? The way that we fight a war in 1930s versus today has just dramatically changed. And so we realized that number one, if you were a household like ours, where we are constantly fighting about what's the role of state. So if you want to argue about what's the role of state in anything, right? And this is something that we did not cover when we discussed the procurement of drugs by state. Like, why is it that when we have, as Murali pointed out, a really big public sector, why do we have government sitting and doing drug procurement? Why does everyone in the country not just go to a normal pharmacy and get drugs? When you have drug regulation that controls for quality and specifies the formulary, why do you need government to come into the picture? So similar kind of thinking that we put on the lens of innovation policy in India. And we came to the understanding that perhaps there is indeed a role for government in something other than just giving us public goods. And so we come to the problem of innovation policy, right? And so this is the challenge that left to yourself, each one of us, when we invest in our own human knowledge, right? We say that we want to go out and get a degree or we want to do some research work. The amount that we will invest is just in terms of the gains that we have. But actually, knowledge is something cooler than that, right? My knowing something uh, actually feeds a lot more people around myself as compared to just me, right? If I get smarter about the way that I buy medicines, then my family learns that, and that is not impact that I'm taking into account when I do the investment. So some technical phrases from public economics is that individual choice mostly works well, right? So a bunch of us get together, the kind of choices that we make goes through the market forces, and then certain things are produced and at certain prices. But there are occasional situations where these just market forces don't come up with optimal outcomes. And that's where we sit and think about what is the role of state. And public choice theory has come up with an understanding that there are four kinds of things where which can be called market failures, which is like monopolies, at which point the state may want to come in and break it up because they have control on the prices, or public goods where no single entity or group of entities can actually create clean air. And information asymmetry, right? That a bunch of people knowing something can take advantage of that knowledge at the cost of somebody else. And the fourth one is the most interesting. It's the externalities. And we often think of externalities as negative externalities, right? So I sit and smoke, and it affects the health of everyone in this room. And if there is state that comes and says in closed buildings or closed spaces, you will not smoke, that actually has a benefit on everybody. But while we think a lot about negative externalities and understand that well, positive externalities also exist. And this is where I think that we have far less clarity on how to have state support a system where positive externalities can be enhanced. So there are spillovers to building knowledge. Like, as I just said, I pay to get better educated, and I choose that investment based on what I am earning for myself. And my gaining knowledge, though, can have a benefit to many people. So when I write and publish a research paper, that research paper is actually something that's come through my brain, my choice, but it informs a lot more people who are reading that research paper, and they get that knowledge, quote unquote, for free. I put a lot of pain and heart in it, but you all get it for free. So this is what we call a positive externality. I'm paying, I'm benefiting, but all of you are too. So clearly the price for my doing that research work should be a lot more than the price that I see for myself. Each of you should actually be contributing even though you don't. So this is the rationale for state action. And this is what we call innovation policy. So note, this is only policy when we think about research. We are creating new knowledge, things that hasn't existed in the world. And the question is, how is it that state can intervene in this in a good way? So here are some examples of the difference between true innovation, which is what we call invention, versus just adoption. So somebody else has done it and we adopt it. So the examples are COVID vaccine, right? Everybody gets the benefit of that. But when we take it, we have a particular problem, which is developing malaria vaccine, which somebody else in the world, the US or the larger pharmaceutical companies don't really have an interest in creating the malaria vaccine because it's a much smaller audience. Military drones, like those that were used in Ukraine, okay, that is for flat ground warfare, as we are seeing now, and tons of innovation is happening. But when we think about our wars, we are thinking about fighting in the Himalayas, right? Completely different scenario. We'll need to do that innovation for ourselves. Natural language processing for English versus natural language processing for hundreds of Indian languages. When you look at all the court cases that are being generated, there are PDF files where even if it's in English, to be able to read and understand what the judge is saying, you need to understand it from the Indian context, right? Climate science, which is more general, monsoon science, which is particular to us. All global STEM knowledge versus what is specific to us, what happens and matters in India. So there is a clear distinction, and there are spaces where we need innovation, which is for ourselves. We can't depend upon the UK and the EU and the US to generate knowledge that we really require because it's retrofitted for us. When you look at, therefore, where is it that state all across the world looks at putting funding into? Remember, this is your money. Taxpayer money is going into creating this research. There are 5 large areas where it goes into, okay? And that's traditionally space, nuclear defense, health, and then pure STEM funding, right? So this is like our DST, which is science and technology. In India, we haven't traditionally done very much funding in health. I think our funding has gone more into agriculture because that was our focus area. But by and large, everything here, other than swap out health and swap in agriculture for health, and that's where we have spent our money. So there's a clear commonality across all countries in where people put tax money into this kind of generation of knowledge. And each of this is at the cutting edge, right? This is stuff that we are looking at which does not exist otherwise. So in this paper, we suggest that society can obtain a bigger bang for the buck from what we are already spending because of the way we spend it, right? So we spent the last two paper presentations talking about procurement. And here we are thinking about procuring innovation. How do you take money that the taxpayer has given you into funding research? And is there a better way to do that as compared to what we do today? And that we recognize that this path runs through public administration problems under our favorite framework, which is contracting. Okay, so let's look at the choices. So whenever a government takes any money from you and decides to spend it into delivering services for you, there are 2 choices. One is called a make and one is called buy, right? Make is when you take taxpayer money, and Kelkar and Shah in their book In Service of the Republic estimate this as the cost to society as 3x. 1 rupee is actually translating into a cost of 3 times, right? And they go out and in ISRO, they create an ISRO. In ISRO, they recruit scientists and engineers. They are all government servants. They spend the last 50 years building a craft, multiple crafts, and one of them today has reached the dark side of the moon. Okay, that's the situation as of right now. But there is an alternative. You raise the same money, so you're paying the same cost, and then you set up an institutional framework through which you can pull all the expertise that is existing in the private sector to do exactly what steps 2, 3, and 4 above are going to deliver to you, right? So you do a design work, which is the minimum superstructure required to get some high-level parameters of what you want to achieve. You want to put a man on the moon. This is what Robert F. Kennedy said in the 50s, right? That was the broad level objective. You already have taxpayer money. The collection of taxes is a system that's already out there. But instead of going out and building an ISRO, what they did was they put out multiple contracts through this step number 2. And that step number 2 is critical, because that's where government says, I don't want all these scientists and engineers. I want to be able to reach out into the private sector and engage with them to do exactly what I want, which is put a man on the moon. It was not a woman. A process of unfolding risk. So you have, note, it's just not one contract, because this is innovation. This is not walking and saying, I want to create aspirin, or I want to create a gun that has been used in the civil wars, right? I want to get something new. So there I just say, I want a gun that does better. And then the question is, who are the people that you're going to engage? That technology doesn't exist yet. And therefore there is risk. And so when we want to be able to do this, if you just contract with one person, no matter how good they are, you're going to probably end up with a very high probability of failure. That's what innovation is all about. So you put out multiple contracts to competing designs. So there can be multiple ways in which you can create a ship that can go to the moon. You don't know which one is going to work, right? So all of those designs have to be what we contract first. Then we figure out, through a process of funding these characters, which design has got a shot in hell of reaching the moon. The risks are minimized or reduced, but not fully finished by the time we come to step 5, which is contract out the design to be put into fabrication mode, and then you send it up to the moon, which is where your proof of concept is. So you can see that from 2 to 6, actually, we're starting with a very high level of risk, which is innovation. You come through a process through which you're minimizing risk at every level. Risk is not completely removed, but at the end, you got a craft that can go to the moon. So what NASA, which is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in the US, does is step number 2. They do buy. Department of Space in India has done make, okay, for most part. And the question is, which is more efficient, which has got more externalities, right? So the pros and cons of buying, because we do make, the pros and cons of buying is, pros are, you've got diversity in design pathways. As I said, you engage with multiple vendors who can give you multiple designs. You don't even know what it is that is going to get, that craft looks like. When you get 10 people to tell you a design, you can get a better choice, as compared with saying, going to one ISRO and saying, now you have to spend your lifetime coming up with a design that works. Diversify the implementation. Once you get a design or a set of designs that actually work, you need to be able to engage with multiple contracts, because one contract is not going to necessarily get your outcome. So what you're trying to do, you're trying to achieve innovation in terms of delivery of a product. Engage existing expertise as compared with creating your own. And most importantly, because you're engaging with the outside world, you will generate positive externalities of knowledge, creating with what is in society and not necessarily kept within state. So you go out and figure out how it is that Department of Defense in the US spends money on contracts. The kind of transparency that you get is much more. Try telling me what the Department of Defense in India contracts, or indeed even ISRO or Department of Space, right? We've tried, Karthik here can tell you lots of sob stories about how he tried to unbundle what Department of Space does in terms of contracting with the outside world, and it's really difficult. So we have a lot more potential for spillovers of innovation that can come out of. I'm saying this is the same investment. We have the same objective, but from the same investment, we are likely to get much more of spillovers, because you're directly engaging with the outside world. The moment you have a Boeing or a Lockheed Martin signed up to do a contract, there are people there who will come and go. Everything that they learn within Lockheed Martin is something that then goes out somewhere else. When you engage with universities, there are lots of people who will learn, because labs have multiple people who will come and go. So the spillover potential for the buy pathway is very high. The cons are, of course, you need to be able to have a lot of confidence in your contracting, because innovation, as I said, is replete with failure. So if there is no possibility of failure, it is not innovation, it's not research. But in India, we do not have the DNA that knows how to contract where there is a high element of failure. I think we just spent the last couple of the sessions just talking about that, right? If there is failure, it's hell on earth. Everybody goes through misery. And of course, there is also the complexity of just managing multiple organizations. When we contract, we like to contract with one party. Whereas what is inherent in what NASA does and in innovation contracting is that you've got to deal with multiple entities at the same time. And so you have to deal with the potential of accusations, the potential of litigations in a faster, smoother way. Today, after many years, we're coming to thinking about mediation as one way out. But someone who's been doing this for the last 50 years probably already has it. And that's what we are seeing in our case study. So what we thought is the first thing that we will do is look at other countries which have used a lot more of the buy in the 4 sectors or the 5 sectors that you looked at, right? Which is space, defense, health, nuclear, and pure R&D, right? And so these are the 4 case studies that are in the paper, which is in column 1, you will see who are the organizations and processes from other countries, and you will see the Indian counterparties in the second column. So NASA's contracting process for space, the National Institutes of Health for health in the US. We don't have an equivalent Indian counterparty here. We looked at France for the defense procurement, our MOD, and then we are looking at one Indian case study, which is the New Millennium Indian Technology Leadership Initiative, which is NMITLI under CSIR. Okay, and there we couldn't find an equivalent foreign counterparty. So I'm not going to take us through all of these case studies. That will be in the paper, and hopefully that paper will be available for you to read by real soon now. Yes, thank you. But what I will do is show you little bits and pieces of, as an illustration of what we found out when we looked at the NASA versus the Department of Space, right? From its very inception, NASA was very clear. They are only going to buy. Okay, this is in the 1950s. Yeah, in the 1950s, when, as I said, Bob F. Kennedy had this dream of putting a man on the moon, and NASA was created, and they were supposed to pursue the most effective utilization of scientific and engineering resources of the United States with a focus on aeronautical and space activities. Okay, and Keith Glennon was the first chairman of the NASA, and he said that it does not make sense to me that even preliminary design contracts could be awarded to industry to round out industry's capabilities. Now, in the NHAI and the discussion so far, we think of contracting as at the heart of procurement, right? And the first phase is, what is it that we are going to procure? What is stunning about innovation policy is that what is it that we're going to be procuring is not clear. Then how do you write a contract to buy innovation? Okay, that's at the crux of the matter, and that's what NASA at the very inception was told. Preliminary design contracts should be awarded to industry, should not be created by ourselves. So then what is it that NASA brings onto the table? Okay, so when we looked at all the issues that made NASA successful, the list that you see on in the first column is just the issue, right? How do you contract? Like, what are the laws that determine how it is that you will sit and write contracts? Second one is what kind of contracts that you can do. Third one, is bidding necessary? That's not even a question that we in India ever ask. We say that everything that government does has to be tendered. You must have a bid. Further, you must have an L1 bid, right? Which is a very narrow definition. Then how is failure defined? And this probably is pertinent to all kinds of contracts, because contracts have some element of failure. There is no perfect contract that's written in the world. In that case, how do you define failure that is acceptable to you? And then how do you manage the contract, right? What do you think of as multiple stages of the NHAI contract during management? How do you know that those milestones have been hit? What are those milestones at which payments must be made? And then finally, there is the relationship between NASA and the government, and NASA and the contracting or the vendor. And how are those principal agent problems solved when you have this intermediary in between, right? Because once you solve that problem, you'll probably have a lot more clarity on, was the failure actual failure, or was it malfeasance and fraudulent behavior on the part of the vendor or the agent, right, who's doing this stuff. So what you see on the checklist is that NASA has got very clear basis from the FAR, which is their procurement guidelines, and they have fixed price. They have multitudes of contracts, contracting types, right? They have fixed price. They had cost reimbursement. They have grants. They have, what are CAs? So they have nice flexibility in terms of creating contracts which fits the profile of an innovation project as compared to what we have. We have contracts for good services works, And cost plus contracts may be allowed, but the scope is extremely limited. So it's nowhere that we can see in the case of the US. Or sorry, NASA, specifically NASA. Is bidding necessary in the case of NASA? No, they can go out and say, you're the expert and I want to contract with you. They can select a set of people and contract with all of them without going through bidding. We have to bid. Delivery for the fixed price contract is they have to deliver something. So a fixed price contract is used at a very specific stage of that innovation checklist that we saw. But for all the other types, good faith effort is sufficient, right? So I give you a grant to do a research design on a particular wheel of a module of the spacecraft, and if you can demonstrate that you've actually taken good effort, then that's fine. You don't have to return the money to me. You don't get penalized. Whereas for us, it is against the delivery of good and service. If that doesn't come, then it's a problem. Contract planning for the NASA is mapped to TRLs, right? Because you go from concept to final product in the market through what is a well-known 7-stage TRL structure. That's what drives the contracting processes, a definition of delivery and effort in the case of NASA. For us, it's based on budget and departmental considerations. And in the case of the last one, which is how do you solve the problems between principal and agent, there is direct supervision. So you have scientists supervising and saying, was there good faith effort in the case of more innovation science-driven projects? And then if there's a product involved, there are other procedural issues that an administrative, a person in some administrative capacity can track the process of. In the case of Department of Space, we have direct supervision, but we have no scope for other kinds of monitoring because, as I said, we have to deliver something. If you have to deliver something, why do you need any other kind of supervision? All right. So illustration number 2, I just want to walk us through our Indian case study, which is the Enmitley case study. And Professor Mashelkar led this. He created this entire dream. And his idea was that we really need to be able to get government money into doing more innovation for India because of that table, right? We need, who else is going to do monsoon science and climate management for us? How does Enmitley work? They give out 2 kinds of projects. One is targeted towards institutions. So an IIT Bombay can say, I want to do a project, but it's typically a government research institution. And the other is industry initiated. The funding mechanism does have grants, but it's only to the institutions. If it is an industry partner, then it's a loan, okay, with some minimal interest payments. The recipient selection is by CSIR, who appoints a screening committee. That is their choice. They may put scientists on it versus as well as people from the industry, but they will have some government appointees on it as well. It is these projects, all of them are periodically monitored and reviewed. They will have an internal steering committee, which meets every 3 months to see how the project is going forward. And they have a monitoring committee, which has got external experts, typically scientists and peers, every 6 months. If the monitoring committee says that the research cannot proceed further, you can end the project before the project maturity, and the remaining grant funds have to be returned. But you don't have to scramble to give all the grant money back, right? So whatever is not spent is returned. How do you deal with, how does Enmitley deal with malpractice? If some researcher is found to be a problem or there's some glitch that is discovered, then there will be some hearing, investigation, but then institute rules are used for that, right? Remember, because it's all through an institution through which these grants go out. If it is a private party, then the firm is supposed to repay the outstanding amount. So once again, they don't have to give the full amount, it's just the outstanding amount, but at an interest rate which is 12% monthly compounded. Remember, the original was a loan, and typically the interest rate is something like 3%. But if malfeasance is discovered, then it jacks up immediately to 12%. Now, why does the story matter? Okay, it's not like they're a very large amount of money. It's in fact very small amounts of money. But it's the first Indian example of direct buy in the form of research partnership contracts and loan agreements. Right? So this is the first time that we've actually institutionalized something like this, right? And it began as a pilot scheme in 2001. It got cabinet approval in 2003. And there was a union government scheme that was put to support this in the following year. This directly buys from private players. but also recognizes the fact that research is inherently risky and might fail. Remember, projects can end and you don't have to pay all the money back. So in case of project failure, which is at the choice or the judgment of the monitoring committee, then you don't have to repay all the money, but it's deemed a failure, it is closed early, and the remaining money is paid back. What do we deem as the successes of NMITLI? So the amount that they've granted so far is about 7.4 billion rupees since the time of inception, right, Karthik? The industry-initiated projects have been 30, institution-initiated projects are 55, and you can see that the balance is still towards government research organizations, not truly private players, but still 30 is out there. Projects where only PSUs and government institutes were involved is 4, and we've had 31 quote-unquote novel technologies that have emerged out of these 85 projects, and 12 out of them have been commercialized. Okay. So what are our learnings from all of these case studies, right? Because we started by saying, let's look at innovation policy and how to strengthen Government of India's innovation policy and what does it take. And our case studies are supposed to give us some guidance on what it is that we are missing. So number one, to the core question, we started this entire thing saying that the reason that we want to think about supporting innovation from using public funds is because we expect spillovers, the positive externality. Has there been any? So there is evidence that has been recorded in the US about the NASA research funding between 1970 and 1990. There were a total of 0.2% of all of the US patent grants. Now, do we want to argue that they are important, it's substantial? I'm not arguing it, but I'm saying it's there. But in terms of development of the industry, NASA research has directly contributed to the emergence of commercial industries in sectors like semiconductors, aerospace, weather, disaster forecasting. I mean, at the end of the day, they gave us the internet.
So just one very quick addition to point one. Those 0.2% of patents had a 10x multiplier. So 2% of all patents cited those patents as why they came up with that result.
Yeah, no, I mean, so as I said, the spillovers are very difficult to pin down, right? And how do you quantify the benefit of the internet? NIH. NIH is the National Institutes of Health in the US. An increase of 1% in NIH research funding is associated with 1.8% increase in the number of new molecular entity applications from private industry. Right? This is not from anywhere else. And the return to public investment in basic biomedical research is about 43%, which has been tested statistically, and they say that it's significantly positive. We studied the defense sector in France and how they do innovation support. 10% increase in government spending on defense R&D in France correlates to about 5 to 6% increase in private R&D. Okay, and the spillovers is that it's just not in France and to the French industry. Actually, because of the interconnections in defense all across the world, this has had an important impact on increases in R&D across some of the OECD member states as well. So when France engages to either sell or buy from other countries for defense purposes, their innovation actually has a positive impact on other country R&D, right? This is like you're reading my research papers and becoming automatically smart. Think of me as the French defense system. NMITLI, what are the learnings from this? Look, we see proof of concept, right? That the Indian government has tried this. There is benefit. There is some success in projects and technologies. We see that. It is probably the earliest of these, the innovations so far. It's early days, yes, but there is some proof of concept. And the question is, how do you scale it up? So what is way forward? Okay. So at the end of this paper, our objective was to see, can we bring more buy-in to the Indian innovation policy as opposed to what we have right now? And what the analysis shows is that there are some changes to the legal framework, but actually we think that it's more a mindset change, which probably is true for everything in procurement, but it's about saying that this is important, there is expertise that we need to do, and these changes are the basis on which we can push those developments. And also to think about what impact does it have in terms of the fisc and what can we visualize as numbers. If we if you're thinking of India today, we're a pretty large economy, and if we could make some of these changes, it would have a tremendous impact in terms of how much money we can put into R&D in India. Okay, so there are some changes to the golden rule book on procurement, which is the GFR, that it should be researchers and scientists and not bureaucrats who monitor scientific projects, right? So you need a peer review of something at a very, like a TRL 0 stage or a TRL 1 stage. There is no product. You need to get the idea and the concept done. And for that, you cannot look at the bureaucrat, burden the bureaucrat or a judge. It has to be a peer. So the competent authority under Rule 2.6 should remain scientists. There should be less of the focus on bidding and tendering requirement for procurement of research. So there are some rules that need, this is Rule 144, which is for goods, and 201 for services, which should be modified to exclude research contracts. So they should not apply to research contracts as compared with other kinds of contracts. One should have a broader embrace of all kinds of entities to receive grants. So right now, the focus is much more on educational institutions, cooperative societies, government organizations, but it should include all kinds of business. Why should an L&T not go out and innovate on building new bridges, right? Or material science? It's just not correct that you think about only government organizations as, or the public sector as innovating, right? So change the scope and definition of cost plus contracts. It should be changed to incentivize the use of cost plus contracts, which we do not do today, right? Because remember, this is about innovation. So when you go up a design path, you may need to look at new developments, new technologies, as compared to what was originally in place when you started the project. The rule should also allow for good faith efforts and not necessarily delivery of something that's tangible. And that's critical for the entire path of innovation policy. And there's also a recommendation that Karthik put in, which is add a chapter on peer review, which says that it should cover the principles on how research organizations should do peer review, which has researchers' peers being the person's best place to judge good faith efforts in research as opposed to the usual culprits. One of the things that we thought, especially when we looked at the Enmitley example, is that if there needs to be an encouragement or a nudge towards more buy, then it should be explicitly there in the mandate of the organization, right? If the founding founding documents of the research organization does not have that procurement should be explicitly it, that engagement with the outside world is explicitly a pathway to get to research, then it's going to be missed out. So, for example, and we are taking the example of NHI because it's explicitly a procurement organization. So it's not about innovation policy, but it's expressly created to unify varying levels of competence and diligence, project preparation, quality control, and development of contracting industry, right? It's not about some public sector organization. Separate out roles played by scientists and procurement officers. There should be clear and separate processes which say that scientific staff should monitor the research project or the innovation elements, and procurement staff should monitor contract process and progress. And of course, one way to improve the loop between we, the taxpayer, and what organizations do is to have disclosure. As I said, it shouldn't be that difficult to go out and ask how much of the pay or the balance sheet or the expenditure of DOS or ISRO is to staff within ISRO versus contracted out to experts outside, even if it is to IIT Bombay, right? There should be much more disclosure as where that money is going, where is the expertise going, because that allows us to track spillovers as compared to what we have today. Today, the annual reports of research organizations are just bizarre because it seems like everyone chose their own disclosures and that's it. Of course, not make versus buy. So higher transparency and disclosure is a broad statement that we think should be pushed a lot more in terms of all kinds of disclosure by government in terms of how the money is spent. Anjali has done yeoman's work to look at the detailed demand for grants of ministries and departments to try to figure out how much of the expenditure that is budgeted is because of procurement or is for procurement, right? It's not something that is explicitly put out. So in terms of transparency and disclosure, I guess it comes back to all of us in civil, in the civil society to ask more of is, it is taxpayer money. Why is there so much of a lack of transparency on how that money is being spent? There should be clear accounting rules that are standardized. Why is the Department of, or the Ministry of Railways so difficult to understand the budget documents versus, say, for example, Ministry of Roads and Road Transport and Highways, right? There should be synchronicity, and that's what a big chunk of our paper recommendations go into. There are some more, but I'm not going to go through all that. I'll just show you what some of the numbers are in terms of the government spending on R&D. This is research funding. The blue line is private sector R&D spending. The span is from 2005 to 2019. The scale on the y-axis is in INR billion. So you have 200 billion rupees all the way up to 600, 700, 800 billion. And you will see that government R&D spending is actually at a tick higher than private sector. Note, this is after mostly government spending R&D on make. What we need to visualize is, suppose they had done a lot of this stuff, like NASA spends more than 90% of their funding on buy. What if we had done the same thing with the money that we had? Could we have got a bigger bang for the buck? So government spending on R&D, of course, the thing that to note here is that even at these levels, right, the blue line, which is private sector spending, has risen by some amount over these last 15 years or so. But in real terms, the government hasn't really moved all that much. Okay, maybe they're looking for good ideas. So government spending on R&D has not grown in real terms. And if we wanted to convert the scientific workforce into more of a contracting workforce, as compared to they are doing their research themselves, there could be a 3% per year attrition of people who are retiring, who are not getting replaced, and a 3% per year decline in OPEX, which is that, equipment, raw materials, all of that stuff is also declining. This implies that the total spend through make is dropping by 3% a year. Whereas what we think is that the share of the budget spent on contracting should be growing by 6% a year. Right? And that is a nice envelope using which you can build new teams, but we need to have an explicit focus on contracting out as compared with making. So what are the strategies for transformation? We know and agree that there are 5 organizations that take up more than 80% of union government research funding, and the different pathways and reforms that we are visualizing or suggesting are: path 1 is all 5 organizations move from make to buy. Part 2 is that if that's a very difficult transition, then new organization ought to be started, which have a buy orientation from the very start. And currently, there are natural components of the Indian innovation system, which are the equivalent of DARPA or the National Institutes of Health, because as I said, health has not really been a focus of any kind of research funding in India so far, but it is the large space where we are going to need to have a lot of work, and the NSF equivalents. Finally, the last part could be a combination of all of the above, right? That you look at an existing organization like ISRO. ISRO is increasingly, or we hear that ISRO does some amount of contracting with the outside world, and that they're changing tracks. We see some defense contracts are going to private sector. Maybe that's what needs to be done in a more structured way, so that we can see what works within the old system, and that needs to be documented and then panned out very quickly to the rest of the organizations that do this funding. I have run out of voice, so I'm just going to leave it up there. We do work on public procurement. We think about contracts as at the heart of the diagnostic element. It's been an extremely useful tool for us. They're a small team. We hear that there are a lot of you who are out there who are also looking at similar problems. We are extending our hand, all fingers. Let's please figure out ways to work together. Thank you.